Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
Hello, I'm Michael Kinsley, editor of the New Republic. Welcome to Firing Line. Commercial air travel used to be a gentleman's sport. It was glamorous, comfortable, quick, and expensive. Now it's very often cheaper, but everything else about it is worse. It's crowded, unpleasant, chaotic, usually delayed, and some people worry it's also not as safe anymore. For better or worse, the man most responsible for the new world of flying is Alfred Kahn. As chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board under President Carter in the late 1970s, Dr. Kahn led the charge for airline deregulation. 10 years later, even he admits everything has not gone exactly according to plan. He didn't quite anticipate so much chaos in the air, and he admits to being dismayed by the rapid demise of the cheapo airlines like People Express. But Dr. Kahn still has faith that air deregulation has basically been a success. Now a professor at Cornell, where he was before he went to the CAB, he also believes there are simple market-oriented solutions to problems such as airport overcrowding. Frank Borman, our other guest, is an American hero, of course. In 1968, he led the first team of Apollo astronauts to circle the moon. But Mr. Borman is also, in a way, a victim of airline deregulation. After retiring from the Air Force in 1970, he went to work for Eastern Airlines, and he rose to be chairman in 1976, just as the deregulation era was beginning. Although Eastern tried manfully to adapt itself to the new era of deregulation, union troubles and mounting losses eventually led to the sale of the airline to voracious Frank Lorenzo, the Rupert Murdoch of the airline industry. Today, Mr. Borman is still a vice chairman of Lorenzo's company, Texas Air, and he's written his autobiography, which is coming out this fall, which is called Countdown. Now, Mr. Buckley, I flew up here this morning on the Eastern Shuttle for $89, which is a lot of money, but that didn't bother me much since you're paying. On the other hand, I can fly to California on vacation for only $99. Now, in a way, that seems crazy, but as far as I'm concerned, deregulation has been a great success. I'm wondering about your point of view. On the one hand, of course, you're a great believer in the free market and unregulated capitalism. On the other hand, you're, of course, a first-class flyer of the old school who's probably been quite put out by some of the changes that deregulation has wrought. I wonder what you think of the new world that Alfred Kahn has helped to create.
Well, Michael, there's a thing called MGM Airlines, which can take you very comfortably in the old style to Los Angeles. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, which granted is unlikely, people who believe in the free market are not unused to anomalies. If an airplane is going from Los Angeles to New York with nobody in it, any passenger that they have on board, no matter what he pays, is better than having no passenger at all. So that to charge $89 on a scheduled flight from Washington to New York, even though you can, by making certain accommodations, pay only a little more to fly to the West Coast, is not, as far as I can see, a defiance of the free enterprise system.
Mr. Kahn, you've surely run into people, however, who will claim to be tribunes of capitalism but complain bitterly about the results of your experiment in free market capitalism.
Well, yes, and it tends to be the people who pay full fare and then have to sit next to unwashed students, or even washed students.
Does one find them?
Oh, at Cornell we have a few, mostly fraternity members. No, as Bill points out, in a free market, competition will give you very low prices in areas in which costs are very low. And on dense routes where you can use great big planes and you can fill them full, partly by offering discount seats when you're not selling your regular seats at the full fare, you can have very low average fares. And also, of course, there's more competition there. But do remember, overwhelmingly, 90% of travelers last year traveled on discount seats.
You've been talking now for quite a while, ever since you instituted this system, about how, in fact, you can prove by multiplying the number of people who have flown and the miles traveled that the net expense per passenger has diminished.
That's right.
Which is, of course. Now, do you have any quarrel with that calculus of feasibility used by him here?
I have none at all, although I was not an early convert to the prospect that deregulation was good. We fought it bitterly at all the airlines did, with the exception. Well, I guess all of them. Southwest may have.
United.
United. That's right. United was. But in any event, I think the experiments worked extremely well. It has created congestion, but you can't blame that on deregulation. That's been due to the fact that the demand has been so great, the system hasn't been able to provide the facility. And so I read somewhere that in 1977, only 25% of Americans had flown. This year, 75% have flown. So we really have made available a wonderful facility to people that in any other country in the world can't enjoy it.
Well, let me ask you this. Given your experience as president of Eastern Airlines, if you could retrospectively have fine-tuned the orders that went down from him, would you have done so? And if so, how?
I would have slowed him up a little. You know, he's very, very... in retrospect, I would have slowed him up a little bit because I think it would have helped us adjust a little more, although I must say I can't complain. The Eastern problem was one that we couldn't solve basically because of an intransigent union leader. We were faced with a set of circumstances that we adapted to quite well until the union leadership changed, and then that nailed it.
I have a profound observation to make.
We will certainly stop for that.
I, in fact, tried to move slowly. I really didn't want the financial markets or Congress to think I was an ideologue, and I'm not, or a nut, which I perhaps am. But the interesting thing is that the process took on a momentum of its own, so that within 6 to 9 months, people in the industry, like American Airlines, who are adamantly opposed, came around and said, well, don't move slowly. If you're going to move, get out of the way. And I think that's a profound point that we see in industry after industry. Once you begin to liberalize, what happens is that other people then come in. Well, it's a little bit like keeping your mustache equal. You know, it's much easier if it gets unequal to cut down on the long side than to wait for the small side, the shorter side to grow.
So, in effect...
That's profound, too.
In effect, they discounted what was going to happen and figured under the circumstances that it happened fast. Okay, now let me ask you a profound question, if I may. We students of Keynesianism, now over 2 generations, in part under the prodding of Austrian economic leadership, have questioned whether the basic Keynesian formula works on the grounds that you have what Frank Borman calls intransigence in what ought to be a movable part. Now, if in fact you are all of a sudden meeting hard competition and you don't have a movable part in the cost of labor, you run into situations from which you can't bail out using the normal criteria. Did you anticipate this? I'll ask you this, and then I want to ask you this. Did you anticipate this as a problem, looking at deregulation as an economic theorist?
Well, we certainly did not expect quite so much turmoil, quite so much violent opposition. You know, we're experts, we economists, in rigidities and resistances and market power. I'm very much concerned even now about the market power that is in some concentrated hubs in the industry. And I would fault the present administration for not being more vigorous in enforcing the antitrust laws. The purpose of deregulation was to open the industry to competition. The purpose of the antitrust laws is to help preserve that competition. Sure, there have been more opposition. I honestly don't know what the Eastern unions really have in mind. I mean, do they really want the airline to go under? Frank was pointing out to me they've already lost 20% of their jobs. And yet that intransigence remains. There's a stubbornness of human nature that is worse than I anticipated.
Well, we should all begin, I think, by acknowledging that hard ideologues don't mind paradoxes. There are 3 newspapers in New York. There were 11 25 years ago, and that shrinkage has largely to do with the intransigence of unions, which ended up with shrinking the market. But let me ask you the question: when this neat idea of deregulation was presented, and you thought, well, okay, to the extent that we have to pull in, everybody has to make a contribution, including people with union contracts. Now, why didn't the normal forces that bring about that resiliency work for you?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Number one, although we've deregulated the economic side of the airlines, we certainly haven't deregulated the labor management relationship, which is rigidly controlled by the Railway Labor Act that was passed, I think, in the 20s to govern the relationships of labor and management on railroads. It had absolutely no idea of a free market, let alone the airplanes that it now regulates. So I suggest to you that we haven't gone far enough in deregulation, that we really ought to do away with the Railway Labor Act applicability in the airline industry. And the second reason is we started off with labor's cooperation. We ended up with a variable wage program in which everybody was able to contribute. We put people on the board. We did everything until we ended up with one ideologue who simply, his goal became control rather than the normal. It wasn't really an economic issue. It was an issue of control. And they're still fighting that now. And as Fred said, when you get ideologues involved, you know, the economic principles are second.
Well, now, does the leverage exercised by this man depend on law, which he exploits? Or is it simply a hold that he has on the membership, which would exist irrespective of any advantages gained from the law?
That's a very good question. I think it's both. The law is clearly prolongs these struggles. So, for instance, the machinist union contract at Eastern ended in December. But through this endless negotiations of mediators and on and on and on, they're still negotiating and continuing under the old contract. We had one at Eastern that lasted 18 months, and it creates a boil that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the animosity on both sides. So.
Now, to what extent did you then, or do you now, retrospectively think of it as your responsibility to point to rigidities brought on by the law that would keep this deregulation from proceeding as smoothly as you hoped it would?
Well, I think that we have to keep perspective. There's no question that Eastern has a very severe problem here. But the important thing to remember is that regulation thoroughly suppressed competition in the industry. Deregulation has undoubtedly unleashed intense competition. The industry is far more competitive than it was before. Now, that creates problems where individuals, management, or labor are unwilling or unable to adjust. But if you look at the industry as a whole, most of the carriers have succeeded in getting their costs down spectacularly. Productivity has gone up spectacularly.
But you wrote recently that you acknowledged that there was no return on capital during the last 2 or 3 years, so that you might really have a synthetic situation, don't you?
I think you did have as little as 2 years ago, when the whole industry lost money.
Yeah.
What has happened since has been that the industry has gone through a shakedown, which is understandable after it had been in a hothouse for 40 years. You've had some consolidations. You certainly have had more of an oligopolization of the industry. And fares have been moving up, so that right now, the last figures I saw were for April. They are now average yields about where they were in 1985. The industry is now very profitable in the aggregate. It's perfectly tenable, present situation, so far as profitability is concerned.
Including generating enough capital to buy this expensive new equipment?
You read the financial analysts, they're predicting a very good year this year, and yet fares are still, average yields per passenger mile are down as much as 25% on average as compared with pre-deregulation. And that means travelers are saving upwards of $10 billion a year, even today. Now, I don't mean to underestimate the problems of individual carriers and individual workers who had privileged, protected positions. Total employment in the industry is up 50%. And the industry, I think, now has reached...
Including controllers?
Unfortunately, no.
They don't work for the industry. I'm talking about the employees of the airline companies. That's up 50%.
And ridership is up almost 50%
yeah.
also. So it's been a very successful experiment.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Borman. Anybody who's had experience with European airplanes, which is a lot of people at this point, recognizes that you move into a surrealistic world. It costs you less to fly from New York to London than it does from London to Rome. Now, how do they manage to maintain their economic standing? Is it by a process of cartelization, of subsidies, or what?
I think basically the Europeans are about in the situation we were in the post-World War II. Only 20% of the European population has ever been on an airplane. Although the airlines, the national airlines, Swiss Air and Lufthansa would tell you that they're not government entities, they listen to the behest and the proclamations of the government. So they're simply running a very fine airline service for the wealthy. And if indeed the European common market...
But how can they compete with us then?
They're going to have a hell of a time. Yeah. You know, this is one area, this is one of the things that's very interesting about the airline industry. This is one American industry that on an international basis is absolutely the most competitive. You know, you talked about Japanese automobiles or German steel.
How can you call it competitive when a price is stipulated, as I understand it, according to some Bermuda conference of 15 years ago, that requires the American airline to charge exactly as much as the Swiss airline?
Well, it's competitive in that the American airlines flying over that route make a lot more money than the Swiss airlines do on it.
Why?
Well, because the Swiss costs are a lot higher.
Oh, I see.
And so the point being that we've held our own very well, and if indeed this deregulation phenomena that started here, where we have the father here with us today, if that continues, I think you'll see a very, very vigorous growth for the American companies.
But the winds of change are blowing in Europe.
That's right.
And there are carriers. There are British Airways, KLM, the Dutch. Of course, the Dutch have always been free traders. They have to be, because after all, how many people live in Holland? There's a lot of competition now on selected routes where the governments are willing to let go. Mm-hmm. The government's mostly the Latin...
I've never been on one of those routes.
Oh, well, they exist, and they're going to be more. There are a lot of new British carriers that are coming in now and flying to the continent. You can get very low fares between London and Glasgow.
Iceland.
No, London and Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And I think that the common market is scheduled by 1992 to be not only a total common market, but to have free competition in the airline business. And when that day comes, I think we should be thinking about letting them into the United States and in exchange for us being free to fly there.
But would they in fact make that trade?
I think that there are many of them who would. There are others, of course, who are protected and don't want competition. Mm-hmm. But the race tends to go. Once consumers begin to see the benefits of competition, the process tends to be cumulative.
It becomes now, yeah. A very interesting point. Did you feel in 1978 political pressure to do what you did, or was it entirely innovative, simply based on what you thought would be the desideratum? I
think it was more political opportunism. And I'm not saying that pejoratively, obviously, in that one saw an opportunity. The Carter administration had to do something right? Well, the Ford administration started it, I must admit.
Well, what really happened, it was in response to an unexpected and unaccustomed increase in fares, because you had the energy crisis, which drove the fuel costs up 10 times. You had the increase in inflationary pressures that cost... An airplane, when we first bought the 727 at Eastern, which was many years ago, I think we paid a little over $4 million. The last one we bought, basically the same airplane, was cost us $17 million. So you had all these pressures come together, and the ticket prices started to go up, and there ought to be a better way. So it was clearly political pressure.
Yeah. We were worried about inflation. We'd shifted from a depression-minded attitude toward an inflation-fearing attitude. And the airline industry was doing very badly. I mean, in the 5 years from 70 to 75, their average return on equity was 3%. They had tremendous excess capacity. You remember they bought all those wide-body jets.
Load factors were low.
Load factors were terribly low. They weren't filling the planes. There were all those beautiful empty seats begging to be filled. And so the carriers began to come in and say, let us offer special discount fares in order to fill those seats. I mean, the time was right.
Well, without intending to explore the analogy comprehensively, would you say that the same kind of pressures brought about the deregulation of the telephone?
I think there it was much more technology. It was the explosion of computer telecommunications technology. And once you had microwave and the semiconductor, and you had all these enormous, I mean, after all, a telephone today is a computer. That is a telephone switch. And you had this opportunity for an enormous growing diversity of services. I think we never would have been willing to continue to entrust the exploitation of that extraordinary
To a single
company, no matter how many Nobel laureates it had on its payroll.
Yeah, and yet that was a judicial rather than an executive or let alone a legislative decision.
But look, it was in part by accident. Nobody really intended that we'd be where we are. But when microwave became available, businesses came in and said, look, we want to put in our own microwave system so we don't have to pay 5 times the cost for long-distance calling. And so the FCC finally said, okay, you put in your microwave. Then MCI came in and said, well, you better let us provide it to other people as well. Then the court said, well, you can't keep it from the ordinary consumer. So almost inadvertently, we got there. But I think underneath it, it was the explosion of technology.
Is it too early to say whether in the communications business, the effects are as directly favorable as they are in the aircraft business?
I would suggest to you that they're probably not, at least as the service, in my estimation, is deteriorated. Now, for instance, I tried to make a phone call from the hotel I'm in today. They have one of these things where you have to go through and dial about 8 different numbers, and I tried for 20 minutes and couldn't get through, so I'm not certain that it has been a success. So I think you've seen more of a deterioration in the service and the telephone business than you have in the airline.
Well, it depends on what dimension of service. All you have to do is read the newspapers and see the new services that are being offered by telephone companies, putting together computer-controlled managerial assistants. Look at what people put on their phones. I mean, because we opened it up. People have not only own their own phones, own a variety of phones. Everybody has a phone you can walk around with. You put on your own answering machines. The variety of service has improved. But there are very great differences. For one thing, most people continue to be dependent upon a single local telephone company. Yeah. So we're not willing to let go, and perhaps we shouldn't. Totally.
Well, what about the $500 million per year spent in research over a period of 2 generations by AT&T down there, New Jersey facility? Is there an analog for that in the airline of business, or is it really the Department of Defense is doing that?
No, I think it's the manufacturers now, and of course the NASA and the Department of Defense had a big hand in it. But I'm not aware of any airline that does any R&D. We depend upon the manufacturers to produce the airplanes with a lot of basis in defense. And you know, but one of the other underlying things that's been very instructive to me in this whole mess, as we hear about the reasons we should continue regulation and that why are the telephones gone through this, is the fact that I think the great American public perceives it's in their best interest. Look how tough Gephardt found trying to sell protectionalism in this primary campaign.
He didn't find it tough in Iowa.
Well, I know, but he didn't do very well beyond Iowa.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
And in South Carolina, all the candidates were saying we need no more restrictions on textiles, which is an incredible. Somehow, the American people have sensed that this is in the best interests of the society.
Yeah. Look what's happened to the clothing component of the Consumer Price Index because of our restrictions on textile imports. There are so many differences. In the telephone case, deregulation has been so impeded by political obstruction. I mean, the American people apparently have come to believe that there's something in the Constitution that says that you're entitled to monthly telephone service for the price of a big pizza, and it never can go any higher. Well, the result is that we're still overcharging long distance $10 billion a year for political reasons to transfer it over to hold down the basic monthly telephone charge. I'm all in favor of doing that for people that are poor, but 90% of the people don't need that help.
Well, that's the same thing. The airline, when we were regulated in fares, exactly the same thing happened. The people that flew back and forth between New York and Miami were subsidizing the shuttle passengers.
Precisely.
Now it's more based upon demand and availability, and it's reversed itself.
Professor George Stigler would not like the way you handle these analogies. He maintains that you can always tell the price of an hour of common labor in any country in the world, because it'll always be exactly the same as the price of a haircut. So
Perfectly. And what, has he been to Japan lately?
It's true, the price of string quartets, too. It still takes 2 man-hours to produce a string quartet. It always has.
Okay, on that note, I'm afraid we can't completely deregulate these conversations here. Mr. Buckley, I enjoyed your very self-satisfied conversation with Frank Borman about the intransigence of labor unions, but isn't one lesson of the deregulation experience the intransigence of corporations? Mr. Borman very bravely, I thought, admitted that at first he and Eastern were reluctant to go along with it. Dr. Kahn said, look, at first none of the corporations wanted to go on, then they began to enjoy it. Isn't a lesson that the government can give corporations a little push toward capitalism?
I think it's hard to answer that question generally. It's true that both parties to any controversy have a great deal at stake. Probably in the last analysis, the consumer is the principal victim, in that if a newspaper goes out of circulation or an airliner goes broke, that diminishes the options. But I do think in the last analysis that this exercise in deregulation has honed economic curiosity about what deregulation can actually accomplish. I remember there was 25 years ago a National Review that Bill Rickenbacker, whose father then was president of Eastern Airlines, proposed that the whole merchandising function of the airlines be accepted by a completely different entity. For instance, American Express might say to Eastern, we're going to buy all of your seats from Miami to Florida at an annual auction, and we're going to pay $500 million for them. Then let them worry about selling those seats, the objective being to see to it that all of those seats are completely filled, even if at the last minute you call up Mrs. Jones and say, for $15 you can do it. In any event, the whole exercise has, I think, been bracing, and I thank you for your elucidating comments.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, Essex Chemical, the American General Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program.